So it was exactly a week ago when I did a video showing how I took the Cinelog 30 frame, put an old 20 by 20 stack from a Cinewhoop, the Reptile Cloud 149, into it, used some newer different motors, set up more for this size frame, got it all programmed, did a nice test flight flying with this 3S 850, just using the FPV camera. That weight was 186 grams. I thought after that video I would go with the configuration, test it out with the bigger battery, the 850 4S, and put my Peanut camera on there, which would be the kind of the configuration that I'd be flying worst case for weight. That would be up to 238 grams. Well, when I did that, one of the motors, which was these, I had selected these 1303.5 4500 ALOS, which I've used on other projects and they work good, but they're more kind of for a lighter weight configuration. One of these motors, the upper right one, number 2, got very hot. I took it off and decided I'm going to swap in temporarily a 1404 3700 into that spot, and do a flight with that heavier setup. And all the motors were hot except the now number 1 was hot. So I made a decision, okay, I'm going to have to swap out and put these motors probably in all 4 spots and kind of give up on these and use these on a different project in the future. Well, in the process of taking it apart, if you also remember, I was using a remote USB connector, 4 wires off of this tied into the controller, and I'm sure you know that the pads on these controllers are I had it soldered into these. These were the 4 pads. Well, it turned out that that setup I had, the wire had ripped out and it actually pulled the pad with it. Was no way, there's nowhere else to connect in. So if that ever happens, that it yanks a pad out, either because you're soldering too hot, or in my case the wire that was connected to it had pulled the pad off with it, you're pretty much out of luck. So I had to go out and buy a similar replacement controller. What's on here is a 4-year-old 405, and luckily on Race Day Quads for about $47 they had this Mamba MK4 405, nice big pads, and it's got a nice USB-C connector instead of that micro USB connector. The only thing I'm going to have to do differently is this one here had connectors for the VTX and for the camera that you could just plug in. I'm just now going to have to hard solder on those to the new controller. So I'll go through, install this, get it wired up, put the motors on, and see how it works. Alright, it's been about 5 days since I got this all put back together. It's been kind of frustrating. Usually these go together pretty quick, but I had so many problems I don't even know where to start. The first thing, as I mentioned, here's the old controller. When I had to replace this controller because the USB extender that I used ripped out the pad, and so that held on there, pretty much making it impossible for me to get in here to do any modifications to the beta flight. So I opted to, rather than just go with where it's already programmed, I decided to get a whole new flight controller. I ended up getting one of these Mamba 405s Mark 4, which is kind of nice. After I got it, I kind of liked it. It's got some things on it that you couldn't get in the old ones. This one's got an I2C port, so you can connect up a compass, and it's got a barometer on it that you can take advantage of. And it has a lot of nice features. One of the things that's turned out to be helpful is it's got a little set of indicators to tell you the status of the gyro, the processor, the VCC high end, 5 volts, 3.3. And this turned out to be helpful when I did some diagnosis of problems that I had. The first thing I did when I got the board was, just plugged it into Betaflight, flashed the new firmware, that matched this particular model, and I had trouble getting it to flash, and it took about 3 hours, but found out there was a driver that I'd never heard about, that if you have a Windows 10 machine, you got to install this particular driver to get Betaflight to work with the flasher. Sure enough, once I did that, I got the flashing to work properly and was able to move on. Once I got it flashed, I was able to set up my configuration, set up my modes, set up my rates. I had to figure out what the VTX table was for this old VTX that I had using on the Reptile Cloud. I got that configured and loaded in, updated the OSD, and then I was ready to wire the controller to the ESC and to the motors, and just getting it all working on the bench without anything connected up to the frame yet. Well, I did that, and got the motors to respond. I set up the directions of the motor directions, and any changes I needed to do for that, I went into BL Heli, got those changed over. Thought, now, all right, I'll just assemble everything, I'll be good to go. I assembled everything, got it together. That's when the point where one of the motors wouldn't work. I mean, what could possibly go wrong? So I had to totally disassemble everything, figure out where I had a problem. Sure enough, one of the solder joints I had where the motor was wired into the ESC had a little bit of a solder bridge, and that was preventing it from working. So I fixed that, put it all back together. Then none of the motors worked. Took it apart again. Turned out that the cable that went from the flight controller to the ESC board was defective. So I replaced that, put it all back together, and then this was the first time I was going to be able to fly it. Well, when I first went to fly it, the video signal, I could tell, was really pretty crappy. And I go, no, what's wrong? I'm using the same camera, same cabling, connecting up to the same, spots on the controller that you're supposed to. And had to take it apart. Turned out that two issues. One was I had a wire that was going from the controller to the VTX. I had it crossing over top of the ESC board, which then it was picking up a lot of interference, and so the signal to the camera or to the VTX was distorted. And then as I was flying, it was losing sync, so I had to disarm, land, and in diagnosing that, it turned out I had to connect all the grounds from the camera, the VTX, and the flight controller all to the same ground point, instead of having them spread around the board like usually shows up on these diagrams. Once I did that, I ended up getting a good VTX signal, but it still was weak. And what it turned out was my particular VTX, which is not the same with all of them, this one requires there to be you basically use the battery voltage rather than the 5-volt voltage source from the regulator on the flight controller. You got to use the battery voltage. So once I did that, which again I should have realized that when I put this back together, once I did that, everything was going good. So then got it all put back together, been doing some flying with it. I'm now going through calibrating the current sensor, which takes a combination of about 4 flights, making adjustments in the BAT page on Betaflight to get that current sensor to read reasonably accurately. But the good news is it's all working, flies great, the motors are not getting hot. I'm using these, as I mentioned earlier, I'm using these Echo 1404 3700 kVs. They're only $10, but they turned out to be very good, and they got good reviews. So that was the problem. My old motors were getting hot because they were undersized for the weight. So now this configuration with this 3S 850, I'm up to 242 grams, and then with the 4S it's up to 252 grams. So not bad for a 3-inch good flying Cinewhoop, and it's all updated now with the new controller, new motors. So we'll get her in the air one of these days. Once it's nice and dry out, we'll do an outside flight. So thanks for bearing up with me here. Learn something new every week in FPV, but hopefully you learned something too. Have a good day.